Now, I would like to call Mr. Philippe Bahoshy, founder and CEO of MAGNiTT. He will be presenting the Jordanian startup success in numbers with a discussion. The stage is all yours.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me today, and it's a pleasure to see so many people here. So by way of introduction, my name is Philippe Bahoshy, and I'm the founder of MAGNiTT, a data platform that covers venture capital investment here in the region. I've been listening to some of the conversations that have been had, and really, for me, the importance is to try and highlight growth in numbers, not just subjectivity. For any of you that may not be familiar with MAGNiTT, we cover emerging markets. That means Africa, the Middle East, Pakistan, Turkey. And the ability to do that allows us to benchmark the data, the information in the venture capital space. All of our research comes from the report, and if you have a QR reader, you're able to download the report for free. Last year, effectively across the global landscape, was a record year of venture capital investments. Globally, US, Europe, even here in the emerging market space, we saw more capital and venture capital investments going into startups than any previous year on record. And again, the different geographies that I mentioned, each of them you will see positive signs of growth from that perspective. And that's extremely encouraging when you're talking about ICT, investments, infrastructure development, and that space. And when you put it into numbers, you've seen almost a 228% rise in venture capital investments, along with a 27% increase in deal flow activity. So more capital is going into later stage investments than we've ever seen historically across the whole of the landscape. And that for me is important to put into context before we jump into what's happening specifically in Jordan. And I always say that it's important to put that in the context of the global space. So while we've seen more of this activity happening in the emerging market space, you can see that really you're only scratching the surface in terms of the activity versus other geographies. Some say it's wrong to compare US, Europe. So let's take Latin America, which has similar demographics to that of the MENA landscape or Africa. And you can still see that there's 5 times more venture capital activity that's happening in Latin America than there is here in the region. And I say this as a positive to highlight that there's still a huge amount of opportunity in this space. But each of the geographies that I highlighted has seen year on year, after a slight slowdown of activity during the COVID pandemic of 2020, increased deal flow activity across each of the geographies, and almost 3.5 times the amount of capital deployment per region. But let's focus on the Middle East. Once we come to the MENA region, so obviously 17, 18 geographies, 350 million people, thousands of startups that are being created, we also saw almost a doubling of the investment activity, albeit only slightly increased in deal activity. If you speak to investors, the thing that happened in the last year is that investors started to focus on more mature, later stage investments than early stage investments. Now, I say that's positive as they continue to grow, but a slight red flag if you want to identify that the bottom of the pyramid needs to continue to grow to see future startup growth in each of the geographies. And that's highlighted here. At the bottom right, you can see the investment deal round size for each of the different levels. And for the 3rd consecutive year, there was a drop in early stage investments than any previous year on record, which is countered by the increase at later stage investment opportunities. 2 reasons for that we highlight. 1, accelerator programs that have historically always been a big driver to investment activity stopped during the pandemic or slowed down. It was a lot harder for them to work in an offline space in a virtual manner than what they did historically. The second is the point that I kind of highlighted, is that investors move towards focusing on companies that are more established than slightly earlier, riskier startups. One thing to note, though, we don't capture angel investments, and that is a big part of the market that solves for early stage investments. And so to benchmark, if you take the top 5 most active economies here in the region from a venture capital perspective, Jordan ranks 4th after UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, which have quickly developed the 3 big hubs for the region. But encouraging to see that Jordan still, given the history of the development of the ecosystem, comes 4th on the list, albeit you did see a drop in the number of deal activities last year compared to the year before. More positively, though, it still ranks 4th in terms of investment capital, having seen a 500% increase in investment capital in Jordanian-based companies last year. And I'll deep dive into that a little bit more in a second. But all of that to say that venture capital is key with all of these geographies. Where is the investment capital going? So when you look at the MENA landscape, fintech has become the industry of choice for investment capital. For any emerging market, one of the trends that we tend to see is that the first industry to be disrupted with technology is infrastructure and almost transport and logistics. If you look at the last 5 years of the region, the big names that you've heard of, the Karims, the souks, the e-commerce platforms, the Insta-shops, etc., are all solving for an infrastructure pain point, using technology to get the product and or person from point to point. Now, as we've seen consolidation, acquisition, exits in that space, you now see that financial services. Now, I come from a financial services background. I worked at Mercer, Oliver Wyman in consulting, banking. The financial services space here in the region is somewhat more antiquated than what exists internationally. And what we've seen now is that startups are trying to solve for, firstly, similar pain points of point to point, i.e. getting money from one location to another, remittance payments or payments platform, and then into slightly more exotic, shall we say, fintech solutions for the region. Hence, across the whole of this space, this is the industry of choice. Similarly, when you look at the investment capital, fintech comes second, albeit the first one is somewhat skewed by a $415 million investment that took place in Kotopi. So if you remove that as an outlier, then fintech, again, in terms of investment capital, ranks first. And interesting to note, when you look at the investor landscape, so 392 investors, this is accelerator programs, PE, VC, all the different types of institutions that have made investments in MENA-based companies. Jordanian-based investors account for 4% of that investor landscape, which comes 5th in the ranking across the whole of the region. In fact, last year, 2021, you saw 45% coming from outside of the region. That means non-regional international investors. And you also saw big name investors, the likes of Tiger Capital, Sequoia Capital, 500 startups global that have continued to be active investing in this space. But it's important to note that still regionally, Jordan accounts for 44% of that investment landscape. And again, we're here to talk about Jordan specifically. So if you deep dive into the Jordanian landscape, last year was a record year of investment activity. This is the last 5 years of investment activity of Jordanian headquartered startups. Now, one of the challenges is, and I'm sure everyone's acutely aware of that, companies start in Jordan, they then relocate their headquarters. The headquarter then changes in terms of investment activity. This is a reflection of all of the headquartered Jordanian startups that received investment. And this is a record amount of investment in that space, albeit, interestingly, unlike other geographies, against the backdrop of a slight drop in the number of transactions. Here, it's interesting to note that the product mix of investment that you're seeing in Jordan is different to that of the MENA region. EdTech startups, e-commerce, transport and logistics startups still maintain some of the more invested startups by number of transactions. Education space in Jordan, which could become a niche for technology, and I'm always an advocate for countries choosing a specific niche, is an area that is more populous than other geographies in the region. Similarly, when you look at the actual investment capital, EdTech, health tech, is more populous than other industries. And then again, I think there's an opportunity there to try and find an industry of choice for Jordanian startups to focus on to see further capital deployment, given the panel that was just speaking was all about the talent that exists in Jordan to help grow and spur on this activity. And for anybody that's fundraising or interested to know who the most active investors are in Jordanian-based startups, this is 5 of the most active investors, including the likes of Oasis 500, obviously located in Jordan, Global Ventures that have remained active in Jordanian-based startups, BNY Venture Partners, Flat 6 Labs, and WAMDA Capital, all of whom made more investments in 2021 compared to 2020 for Jordan. And in terms of the 5 biggest investment deals, it's a bit blurry, the slide, but basically Eon Dental, Cyberscope, Abwab, Tamatem, Abwab again, 2 investment rounds that they made, accounting for the large proportion of edtech investments in the country. And so for anyone that's interested in any of these reports, you can get them on the platform specifically. And again, I'll leave the last slide to highlight the QR code. If anyone wants to download the free report, you can get it on the... You can get it on MAGNiTT, but if you put it, if I can get there. If you get the QR code there, you can download the whole of the report for free. That's where I stop. I'm going to be around afterwards if anybody has any questions, but I believe that now there's a panel discussion to discuss this as well as the emerging space in Jordan. Thank you very much. If you have a question, happy to take questions as well.